Hi folks, and welcome back. I'm Pinat Reports and I report on the unreported. So where am I today? Well, I'm in the beautiful Accrington. Accrington is a town in the Hyndburn borough of Lancashire. It lies just about 4 miles east of Blackburn. Now, fun fact for you. Did you know Accrington is actually famous for manufacturing the hardest and densest building bricks in the world? Did you know that? Accrington bricks are actually being used, have actually been used in the construction of the Empire State Building in America. How fascinating. And not only that, also for the foundation bricks of the Blackpool Tower. Gee whiz, that's absolutely insane. I thought that was brilliant when I read that. I thought it was fascinating. I did not know that about Accrington. And so I'm here today and it's absolutely beautiful, and I'm in the cemetery and it's absolutely amazing. Some of the memorials in here are incredible, and look at this, beautiful behind me. So without further ado, let's get into today's story. And if this is your first time around here, hit that subscribe button and hit the bell icon to be notified of all my future fascinating stories and historic wonders. It's not often a story truly affects me and probably you. But today we have a story that's so tragic, it's almost hard to comprehend it actually happened. But it did. This is a true story of how a widowed lady with a beautiful young child met a man whose violent and twisted anger caused him to undertake an act so gruesome it left this beautiful child with such horrific injuries that it would affect the rest of her life. This is their story. In the month of September of 1923, local residents around here were left in disbelief as a horror unfolded over at Victoria Street, here in Accrington. A young gentleman by the name of John Wally was a 32-year-old, well-built, sandy-haired and good-looking man. On the surface, at least, he was a good catch for any woman. But John Wally had his drawbacks, not the least of which were a violent temper and a worsening fondness for alcohol. John Wally liked a drink. Now John Wally, he became acquainted with a lady called Miss Maud Wildman. Now Maud Wildman was an attractive and pretty young woman of the town. So she was from the town of Accrington. And she was a catch. Now Maud Wildman, she was a widow when she first met John Wally. Sadly, her first husband, a Mr. Joseph Wildman, had died in Scotland on munitions back in November of 1918. They had a daughter, and their daughter was called Agnes Wildman. Now Agnes Wildman was just a few months old at the time of her unfortunate father's death, and so she was too young to even acknowledge or remember him. Now little Agnes, the daughter, was less than 3 years old when Maud tied the knot with her future stepfather, John Wally. The couple got married on Easter weekend in 1921, and after which they moved in with John Wally's parents to number 15 Claret Street in Accrington. John Wally, Maud and little Agnes lived here with John Wally's parents at number 15 Claret Street. Now, most young couples starting out on married life in one of the parental households soon come to regret that arrangement. It's awkward, disruptive and unsatisfactory in every respect. It was only tolerated out of necessity. Perhaps this state of affairs contributed to the problems experienced by John Wally, his new wife and stepdaughter, for Maud soon discovered her husband was a bad-tempered individual, or as he was described at the time, a man of considerable passion. So that's what he's been put down to. He's bad-tempered, but in those times that's how they would have described him. So Maud also quickly became aware that he treated little Agnes and herself badly, which must have alarmed and disappointed her, destroying all earlier hopes and expectations of a happy new life for her daughter and herself. In September 1922, probably a last attempt to mend matters between John Wally and Maud, all three of them, including little Agnes, moved into the house of a Miss Sarah Ann Horbury at 12 Victoria Street here in Accrington, just as lodgers. Now, the house would have once stood along here. That's Victoria Street over there. Now, Miss Horbury, their landlady, said that she had no trouble with her new tenants for the best part of a year. But relations between John Wally and Maud had clearly been deteriorating during that time. Rows and arguments had become the norm, and John Wally's belligerence and bad treatment of his family increased, along with his consumption of alcohol. He took to threatening his wife, even on an occasion promising he would kill her. Unwisely, she retaliated by waving her hands in front of John and telling him that he could never take her means of making her own living. So in other words, as long as she has her hands, she could earn a living, you know? But this would lead to even more abuse and sinister threats by Wally, even going as far as saying he would abduct little Agnes, Maud's daughter. At dinner time on Monday the 17th of September in 1923, matters which had been festering for so long came to a head. Maud, coming home from her work as a weaver at Ellesmere Mill at Woodnook, found there was no food for dinner. John Wally had eaten it the previous night for his supper. Though this may seem relatively insignificant in itself, for Maud it was the last straw. There and then she told Wally she would have to leave him. His snarling reply was simple: "Well, get out." Maud, afraid of staying in the same house with her husband any longer, left Miss Horbury's premises and went to stay elsewhere. Soon after leaving the house, Maud came here to the school in Woodnook in the middle of the afternoon, and she took Agnes away, little Agnes. She explained to the teachers that she was afraid John Whalley, who she described as a crafty man, would try to take their daughter. So the school authorities were therefore well aware of the situation and circumstances at home. Now Maud, she didn't go stay with her sister over at Clement Street, as she anticipated Whalley might come looking for her there. She returned on a discreet flying visit to number 12 Victoria Street, however, to remove her own and little Agnes's clothes, carefully avoiding Whalley, who was out drinking somewhere at the time. So Maud, after getting her clothes from Victoria Street, she then went to the police station here in Accrington, and she caused a summons to be served on her husband, John Whalley. It required John to appear at Accrington Police Court on Wednesday of the following week to answer to allegations of persistent cruelty and willful neglect. Needless to say, Whalley was not too pleased to receive the summons. That night, the police, they watched the house where Maud and little Agnes were staying, and they also watched Maud's sister's house just in case. But nothing untoward happened. On Tuesday, the 18th of September, Miss Horbury, the landlady here at number 12 Victoria Street, was up early as usual. Now, due to the events of the previous day between him and Maud, between John Whalley and Maud, John Whalley was told he too would have to leave the house. He had agreed to hand his key back later that day. A Mr. Walter Taylor of Grange Street saw John Whalley here in the Poplar Club about 11 a.m. that very same day. Whalley had a pint of beer and a game of billiards before leaving the club just after midday. Later, at around 2:30 p.m, John Whalley returned here to the Poplar Club. He had another pint, but significantly left at 3:15 p.m. John Whalley purposefully made his way from the Poplar Club to little Agnes's school here at Woodnook, a distance of only around 600 yards, arriving here at approximately 3:20 p.m. A Mrs. Westwell, headmistress of the infants department, and here, upon seeing Whalley, asked him who he was. Whalley, presumably keeping his distance in case the headmistress smelt alcohol on his breath, began to tell the story that he had concocted to secure the removal of his stepdaughter from the school. He tried to blag the headmistress, stating that relations between himself and his wife were now restored, and the family had arranged to visit some friends over in Rishton, and they were all anxious to catch the 4 p.m. train, hence why he was here to get little Agnes. Now, Mrs. Westwell, the headmistress, she was all well too aware of Agnes's mother's concern that her husband might try to abduct their daughter. She asked Whalley if the girl's mother knew that he was here collecting her. He claimed his wife had sent him, and for good measure he repeated the train story about going to visit friends over in Rishton. Mrs. Westwell then inquired when they will be coming back. She was told the family they were only going for the night, and that Agnes would be back in school the very next morning. Wally, as far as she could judge, seemed perfectly normal, absolutely nothing wrong with him. But despite some misgivings, Mrs. Westwell, the headmistress at the time of this school, let John Wally take the little child, and they left together. So the blagging worked. John Wally managed to remove little Agnes from this school, even after the school was warned by the mother. The headmistress should 100% have refused Wally's request, however plausible it may have seemed. Tragically, after Agnes had left with her stepfather, the headmistress sent a communication to her mother. A message, when received, that must have sent a deep chill into Maud Wally's heart. After leaving the school with Agnes, John Wally, the stepfather, and the child were seen walking hand in hand in the direction of Victoria Street. They would have walked from up this direction, which is Mount Street, reaching where I am now. Both would have walked down here and up Victoria Street at around 3:40 p.m. On reaching number 12 Victoria Street, Wally opened the door and little Agnes rushed inside, calling out for her mother. Seemingly, she'd been told that Maud was there by her stepfather. Miss Horbury, the landlady, she was up the stairs, and at hearing the calls of the child, she came down. Without warning or saying a word, John Wally approached Miss Horbury and hit her brutally between the eyes with his clenched fist, knocking her completely to the floor. Pulling her up by her feet, he dragged the elderly lady into the back kitchen, and he continued his assault, knocking her down and down again, hitting her with a shovel and kicking her repeatedly. When she saw all the blood resulting from her injuries, Miss Horbury cried out, "Now see what you've done." At about 4 p.m, the Withnell family, who lived at number 18 Victoria Street, just a few doors down, heard a faint knock at the back door. They thought they were imagining the noise, so they took no notice, till a few minutes later it was repeated. Now the back doors from all the houses, they all looked out to a common yard, so all the houses had access to this back area. Mr. Withnell's daughter went to the back door to investigate the knocking. Upon opening the door, she was horrified to discover her neighbour Miss Horbury in an almost unrecognisable state, collapsed, her blood-soaked hair hanging disordered and matted around her shoulders. She was bleeding badly from severe head and facial wounds. One of her eyes was completely closed, and her face was quite grotesquely swollen. Somehow, from number 12 to the Withnell's house at number 18, Miss Horbury had negotiated 4 flag steps and walked the length of 3 houses in a state of shock with almost horrific injuries. Raising the alarm and summoning help from the rest of her family, the young woman assisted Miss Horbury into the house, where attempts were made to staunch her wounds, and the Withnells asked, how did this happen? How did she get in such a state? But she was too traumatised. The trauma from her experience prevented her from explaining and all she could murmur under her breath was, "I've lost my teeth." So Dr. Brooke was immediately sent for. A Mr. Walter Wilson, a delivery driver, was actually in Victoria Street at this time, and he briefly saw John Wally at the front window of number 12 and said he was in a wild, dishevelled condition. Becoming aware of this, he went to Miss Horbury's house and tried the front door and the back door, finding both closed and locked. The thick curtains prevented him seeing into the kitchen. Nevertheless, he quickly made his way to a nearby mill and telephoned the police. Dr. Brooke, by this time, arrived at number 18 Victoria Street at the Wivenel's house and treated Miss Horbury's injuries before ordering her removal to the Accrington Victoria Hospital. Now, Inspector Walling, in charge at the Accrington police station, he dispatched two officers, PC Maudsley and PC Flegg, to deal with the incident down at Victoria Street. On arriving at the Wivenel's house at number 18 and seeing the wretched state of Miss Horbury, the two police officers rushed to number 12 Victoria Street. Surprisingly, they found the front door slightly open, not knowing what they were about to witness, a sight that they would take to their grave. There, on the rug, between the table and the fireplace, little Agnes was on her knees leaning forward. There were two pools of blood right in front of her. She was fully conscious, but she was rocking back and forth with her arms pressed down to the floor. It was then that the two constables saw lying under the table less than a yard away. Both of the child's hands had been completely severed at the wrists. At that moment, the two policemen must have felt the presence of pure and putrid evil in the room. Suddenly, Agnes spoke up and said, "I don't live here. He brought me." It was at this point the two policemen noticed a strong smell of gas in the house. PC Maudsley stayed with Agnes and did what he could, while PC Flegg went to the kitchen. There he found John Wally unconscious with his shoulders on a gas boiler. He was bleeding from a gash in his throat. In his mouth was a flexible gas tube attached to the pipe supplying the gas boiler. PC Flegg took out the tube from Wally's mouth and he laid him on the floor. Inside the gas oven, he found a cap indicating that at some point Wally tried to place his head in the oven. Several of the gas taps were fully on, and the officer quickly turned them off. Dr. Brooke was summoned, and he did his best to bind the little girl's wounds. She was then removed to the hospital in the same ambulance that took Mrs. Horbury. Later, Dr. Brooke treated John Wally, and he too was taken to the hospital. It was noted later that the gash in Wally's throat, though it was 5 inches long, it was not very deep, and somehow he avoided the windpipe in any major artery. The sincerity of the suicide attempts is inevitably called into question by such circumstances. It is noticeable generally how all too many ruthless and efficient killers subsequently become inept and blundering when attempting their own suicide. So an examination of the premises revealed signs of a major struggle. Miss Horbury stood her ground. She put up a fight as best as she could. The kitchen was spattered with blood. On the floor and halfway up the door it was covered. Behind the door was a pool of blood, and nearby were found several hairpins and the remains of a set of false teeth that had actually been crushed and trampled on. More ominously, in the kitchen lay a razor propped against the wall. There was also a coal shovel covered with blood and hair. By 5:30 p.m. that day, the three injured parties, John Whalley, Miss Horbury and poor little Agnes, were receiving attention at the Accrington Victoria Hospital from the police surgeon, Dr. Wheeler, and other medical staff. On our way to the hospital, little Agnes said, "Oh, my hands, they do keep hurting." How she remained conscious throughout this entire insanity is quite incredible. The police surgeon, Dr. Wheeler, called here at Accrington Victoria Hospital late in the afternoon on the 18th of September to find little Agnes in the operating theatre. Her hands had been completely severed from her arms, right through the wrist joints. Her right arm also had a 2-inch wound right on the bone, and it was 1.5 inches above her main wound. So clearly a preliminary attempt at her stepfather's grisly objective. So he's tried to cut her hand off and failed and moved position until he succeeded. Agnes, in profound shock, also had a large area of bruising over her left hip bone, bruising and abrasions on both her legs. And she required an incredible operation to make tolerable stumps of her arms. The pressure exerted by kneeling and balancing on the stumps of her arms after what happened undoubtedly stopped the flow of blood and prevented her from bleeding to death. Now, Agnes was visited here frequently by her mother. The whole time she was in here, Maud came up and saw her, obviously. And at 5:57 p.m. the same evening, Dr. Wheeler saw Miss Horbury, who had a fractured nose, extensive bruising to the face, particularly the left eye. She had 3 incised wounds at the back of her head, each 2 inches long, extending to the muscle, plus extensive bruising all over the rest of her body. She was only semi-conscious and, like Agnes, in a profound state of shock. At 8 p.m. the doctor went to see John Whalley, who by then was completely conscious. Dr. Wheeler then made the serious mistake of questioning Whalley about the incident rather than sticking solely to medical matters. Inspector Walling had Whalley placed under arrest immediately after the incident, and he should therefore have been cautioned before being asked any questions, particularly if those questions were asked by the police surgeon. Because nowadays, with the onset of the Human Rights Act to complicate the situation, it's quite possible this whole case against Whalley could have been seriously compromised. So Dr. Wheeler asked Whalley if he knew what he had done, and Wally said yes. The doctor then inquired why had Wally done such a thing. The chilling reply came: jealousy. I wanted to get at the mother through the child. On Wednesday, the 26th of September 1923, John Wally made his first appearance before Accrington magistrates, here at the old magistrates court behind me. Wally, he was smuggled from Victoria Hospital to the court via the police yard. Wearing a dark brown suit and with a week's growth of a beard, he looked very pale and still had his throat bandaged. He was handcuffed and he walked with his head bent forward, his eyes fixed in front of him. As the main witnesses were unfit to attend, Maud and Agnes, Wally was remanded in custody for a week. He was then quietly removed from the court and taken to Preston Gaol. On Thursday, November the 8th, the magistrates finally heard the charges against John Wally at a special sitting here at Accrington Magistrates Court. It was cited: feloniously wounding Sarah Ann Horbury at 12 Victoria Street by means of a coal shovel with intent thereby to murder her, and feloniously, unlawfully and wilfully causing grievous bodily harm with intent to maim to his stepdaughter, Agnes Wildman, aged just 5 years old, by severing both her hands with a razor. Now, the weather was bitterly cold on that day, but it was nerves that led John Wally to repeatedly bite his nails in the dock of a crowded court. The story of the tragic sequence of events on Tuesday the 18th of September unfolded with a series of witnesses telling the tale. Then, suddenly, there was a tense silence as the little victim's name was called: Agnes. Agnes had been in an adjoining room with her mother, on whose knee she sat at the solicitor's table in court while making her statement. She was not sworn and spoke in a low voice, though perfectly clearly. The little girl wore a dark brown cape, a grey woolly hat, and a pair of gloves on her arms that hid her terrible injuries. Occasionally, she turned and looked at her stepfather in the dock. She described him picking her up from school and taking her to 12 Victoria Street. When Wally met Miss Horbury at the bottom of the stairs, Agnes, in her own words, said he fighted her. She told the court her stepfather then took her in the front room and took a razor from the drawer and stated, "He cut my hands off." Wally was committed to stand trial at the Manchester Assizes on both charges against him, and he had typically nothing to say. On Saturday, the 8th of December 1923, at the Manchester Assizes, John Wally pleaded guilty to both of the charges against him. Consequently, the proceedings barely lasted half an hour. Everybody in court was deeply moved by the terrible story outlined by the prosecution. And when Wally's attack upon the little girl was described, members of a jury expressed their emotions via involuntary exclamations of horror. So the judge a Mr. Justice Branson was visibly moved as he listened to the facts of the case. No mitigation by the defence counsel could save Wally from the punishment his crime demanded and deserved. Wally himself expected the heaviest sentence that could be imposed. He was not to be disappointed. Mr. Justice Branson chose his words carefully and delivered them with deep feeling and emotion. The story of your offence is the most horrible to which I have ever listened. A cold, calculated, fiendish attempt to be avenged on your wife through this unfortunate little girl. I am afraid that no punishment that I can inflict upon you is adequate. There is a maximum I can give, and I will. You will go to penal servitude for life. And to me, that's not enough. To me, even death probably is not enough for this guy who did this brutal act upon this beautiful little girl. But that's what it got. John Wally got sent to penal servitude for life. As for little Agnes, for the rest of her life, she had to get by on a day-to-day basis. Thankfully, she married and she lived a good life up until a good age, finally residing in the Barnfield area of Accrington. Local children growing up, they knew her as the lady with no hands, though it's unlikely any of them knew the story behind her disability. Her suffering and frustrations over the years can only be imagined, but her incredible courage in those dark days of autumn in 1923 shine like a beacon. Agnes was a truly incredibly brave little girl who endured such horrific and traumatic experiences. But she stood brave. She stood brave at court to give evidence against John Wally, a man she should have looked up to, a man she should have cared for, a man who should have cared for her and provided everything that she needed. But due to his own selfish jealousy towards Maud, he took the ultimate revenge against poor, defenceless little Agnes. So there you have it, folks. I'm back where I started this morning. A round trip of Accrington, discovering this incredibly gruesome and traumatic story of a beautiful little girl, Agnes. It's a horrific story, but thankfully it didn't end completely. In other words, she didn't lose her life, thankfully, unlike so many other tragic stories. Not that losing her hands wasn't enough. Absolutely it was. That is incredible. How she survived that is a miracle. But she did. And she lived a long, good life, thankfully. Well, the best that she could. Absolutely amazing. And I just, honest to God, it's a very overwhelming story. There's a lot that happened to that little girl, and I can never comprehend what she went through. So again, I won't say I hope you enjoyed this story, but I hope you found it as fascinating and as interesting as I did, because it's truly one of those that really struck a chord with me. Absolutely insane. So thank you. Thanks so much for tuning in and watching this story. And if you enjoyed this story, and if you haven't already, hit that subscribe button to keep up to date with all my future fascinating stories, historic wonders, and the odd haunted happening. And hit that bell icon to make sure you get your notification. So thanks again, guys. I really do appreciate each and every one of you guys tuning in to watch. Until next time, you all take care and all the best.